My name is Mike Swetnam, and I'm the CEO and Chairman of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and it's my privilege to welcome you here today for a discussion on terrorism, victimization of women, children, costs, lessons, and future outlook. It has been the honor of the Potomac Institute for quite some time, about a decade and a half now, to be the home of the International Center for Terrorism Studies that is headed by Professor Yona Alexander, who will moderate and chair today's session. The Potomac Institute is all about science and technology policy and how science and technology, the modern age, in the modern age, can be used for the good and the benefit of mankind, and how we need to deal with those who will use the tools of our technology and the tools of our civilization against us. And for that reason, we have been the host and sponsor of the Center for Terrorism Studies here at the Institute for almost 15 years. Terrorism, of course, old as society itself. Modern day terrorism, the use of the tools of our society and our technology against civilization. Is there any more or any better example of terrorism, not as a tool for freedom fighters, but terrorism as a barbaric tool of war? Is there any better example than the effect of terrorism on women and children and those innocents among us who make society what it is? In the last year alone, just from the large incidents, we can talk about hundreds of young girls in Africa kidnapped, brutalized, and killed. 140 children in Pakistan, not more than a handful of weeks ago, murdered and slaughtered at the hands of terror. So every time you hear a discussion by a press secretary somewhere about the difference between the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, remember that the one place where there is no difference is in their effect on the innocents among us. And that, at least to me, is what characterizes terrorism in the modern day. It is a scourge of society that people will use this horrible, barbaric set of acts and justify it based on their political or religious beliefs. And when it affects our children and our women, we should be incensed in a way that we haven't been before. That makes today and today's discussion one of the most important ones that have been held by the center that Yona hosts. As you almost certainly know, if you're watching this or if you're in the audience, Professor Alexander has authored 100 books, over 100 books on terrorism, every aspect of terrorism. He hosts more than a dozen seminars a year all around the world on all aspects of terrorism. He explores academically the causes, effects, and things that we can do about terrorism. Today, he's dealing with, and he's brought together some of the best minds and I think some of the best speakers in the area to address what is one of the most insidious and horrible aspects and effects of terrorism, its effect on women and children. So I invite you to not just listen closely, but during question and answer, be involved and hopefully leave the session today with a new spirit of dedication to do something about preventing this type of terrorism in the future and for our grandchildren. The session will be, as I said, chaired by Professor Alexander and then concluded with concluding remarks by our Board of Regents Chairman, General Al Gray. But with that, let me turn the session over to Professor Alexander, who will have a few words to say and then introduce our great panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Welcome to our seminar on the victimization, women, children, and we'll deal with some of the definitional issues, the costs, the lessons, and most importantly, how can we deal with that particular challenge. First, let me welcome our distinguished panel. First, Dr. Kathleen Kenneth, right here, who is the director of the Center for Gender and Peacekeeping, of Peace Building, but you need peacekeeping as well at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Next to her is Professor Patricia Malden, who is a professor of conflict resolution and director of the Dialogue and Difference Project of the School of Conflict Analysis Resolution of the George Mason University. Next to her is Nina Shia, and welcome. Thank you very much. I hope you get something to eat before you speak. She is the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. This is one of the institutions we cooperate with on international human rights, a lawyer as well for many years. Next to her is Professor Mike Noon, my colleague going all the way back from Catholic University, Columbus School of Law. And then Dr. Mir Sadat, who is Professor of National Security and Foreign Policy of the National Intelligence University. I will say a few words about them later on, but you do have the bios, so we'll save a little bit time. So as I said, I think we have a very, I think, important topic to deal with, but as always, I think we have to look at the historical lessons. I'm not going to make a speech now, but just to remind all of us one or two lessons, one I think universally and one personally, which are relevant to the contemporary situation, the future outlook related to women and children. If I may, with your permission, today is January 30th, and it is really anniversary if we look at the year 1349, over 650 years or so, when the Jewish community in Freiburg, Germany, they were accused of poisoning the water wells in the city in order to spread the Black Death disease. And all the Jews actually were burned on a stake, except the pregnant women and children. So the question really arose why the pregnant women and children were excluded. And the reason, in a way, is simple but also complicated. In order to baptize the children to Christianity, and then the pregnant women yet to give birth to children in the future in order to save these children, their souls from hell. So this is the historical, I think, lesson. In other words, what is new about that? And also now this month, we mark the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as you, I'm sure, know. And if I may, with your permission, on a personal note, mention that exactly this month in 1943, about 200 Jews, including women and children from the city of Grodno in Poland, where my family lived for over 550 years before, but part of that family were killed in the Holocaust, and that particular period, they were deported from the city of Grodno, which today is in Belarus. they were deported to Auschwitz and they were killed and gassed. And again, if I look at this both as an academic and personal level, as a human being, obviously we should be concerned. And every single day, as Mike indicated, and in fact, the news that we just heard about the attack in Egypt and Sinai, which caused probably more than 40 casualties. People were killed and many wounded, including civilians. And obviously, every single day, we have to face that kind of challenge, which involves women and children. So again, we do have a very distinguished panel. We certainly have to express our sympathy and condolences to the families of the victims. And obviously, we have to recognize those who are trying to protect the women and children. So I think the first speaker, she will provide some context to our discussion, is Dr. Kathleen Kunest, as I mentioned, from the U.S. Institute of Peace. She worked on many of these issues, women in war, publications. She was a distinguished scholar, many of the institutions, including the Woodrow Wilson Center and so forth. So I think she can provide this sociological, if you will, and cultural point of view, and to somehow define the nature of the threat and what can be done about it. Dr. Kunest, please.
Thank you. Do you want me to be?
Yes, it would be a little bit better than we had the discussion there.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Alexander and Mr. Sweden, to be a part of this panel today. It's delightful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Although I lead several projects on women and preventing violent extremists at USIP, I do not claim to be a CVE expert, but instead I am a social cultural anthropologist, an expert on societies undergoing transition, and more specifically on the impact of change on these gender roles in society. I want to add that my statement today really reflects my own views and does not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So very quickly, I would like to cover three themes: why gender matters in our analysis of violent extremism; second, the role of women in preventing violent extremism; and the last, what are some of the policies in place that help empower this overall effort? To respond to the violence against women and children, we must address gender in its sociological, anthropological sense as not simply another name for women and girls, but indeed men and boys are also gendered beings. You might ask why this distinction is important, but I think if we're going to do a deep analysis, we have to understand that if we're only looking at women and girls, we're only addressing half of the issue. And therefore, we only will provide half a solution to the many problems that do plague women and girls in conflict, violent, and fragile settings. So I just want to make sure our themes here are aligned. To say that gender is a highly malleable social identity process, and it is a learned process based on values, behaviors, expectations, and it is not necessarily simply about your biological sex. Why is this important? Part of the argument I'm going to suggest to you here this afternoon is that one of the key framing tools, if you will, of violent extremist groups, and I'm going to use here the term Daesh for the Islamic State, but they really tune in to the concept of what we would call hypermasculinity. We have to look at these videos that they put out, and I'm sure people here have looked at them, studied them, but they especially seek out young men, as they say, who have nothing to do but play video games, and they pull on them. They say, come be a real man. This type of identity processing is very attractive to many young people. They're being offered a mission, a job, a built-in community where manhood is defined as a violent path to power. Now, again, we have many other notions of manhood. We know peaceful manhood. We know people who are men who have no violent tendencies as such. So we cannot normalize even our own conceptions. But instead, we need to understand from this gendered perspectives, especially in societies where nearly 70% of the population is between 16 and 35 years of age, where jobs are scarce, and where such expectations pose an almost impossible hurdle to the ideal of manhood. So, what incentives do they offer men, groups like ISIL or Daesh? How are societies able to counter this kind of idea, in other words, of what I would suggest to you is failed adulthood, where they express frustrations through extreme violence and distorted notions of power? So unless we broaden our discussion to one that incorporates a much broader gender definition, we add to the normalization of that's just how men are. And instead, we don't begin to analyze how we can intervene in this notion of a violent rite of passage for an entire generation of young men. And I will add young women fit in this dimension as well, but that are following a lure of power through violence, where the definition of adult man includes the power to oppress women and children, to employ slavery, and to use sexualized-based violence as a function of power and a sense of belonging. And so let me shift now. Just as I wanted to define gender in a broader way, I also want to take the theme of this talk this afternoon on victimization of women and shift it to the concept of, I'm going to skip that, of empowerment. Over the past 3 years at the Institute of Peace, we have been working on a pilot series of programs to actually strengthen women's understanding about radicalization and to better support networks among women's organizations, in particularly Nigeria and Kenya. We are looking at bolstering, in particular, mothers' awareness and their skills for analyzing their own predicaments. We have been working with the international NGO Sisters Against Violent Extremism, otherwise known as SAVE, which focuses on the pivotal role that women can play in their family, their community, and other spheres of influence. Building capacity and parenting skill among mothers whose sons may be at risk of radicalization come together in what we call mother schools, where they gain increased awareness, confidence in recognizing the early warning signs of radicalization. And through this affiliation with other mothers, they expand their reach of influence and, I will add, begin to deal with the type of stigmatization that occurs in certain societies if a member of your family has been associated with a violent extremist group. In other words, they are helping to understand how do we bring young people children and adolescents back into the community fold if they come back, if they can be de-radicalized. And so these are some of the efforts underway in a very pilot and very, I would say, context-driven situation in both Kenya and Nigeria. It is one of the key takeaways in this work is that we are focused on training in critical thinking and problem-solving skills. Many of these women, if they do not have any education, they have learned through oral traditions, religious traditions, but they lack the process of how do I ask questions about this or that? How do I begin to critically sort out what I am hearing, what am I learning? And so this is one way that women are beginning, even in their small home communities, villages, to sort out these questions. Outside the home, on a community level, women can be voices of tolerance and can provide strong counter messages to extremism in their communities. Specifically, in work we're doing in the Jos Plateau region of Nigeria, women religious leaders, both Christian and Muslim, have been working as mentors in their community. As a result of this training, they have expanded their roles to mentor, provide counseling, guidance to vulnerable youth. Although the role of women is vital to countering extremist violence, the important role that fathers play should not be underestimated. In the case of course, the famous now Malala Yousafzai, her education was strongly encouraged by a father who understood that girls should be educated for the good of the child and her country, even in a very conservative society in Pakistan. So it is clear that there is high demand for women for knowledge and skills to prevent violent extremism, and we must be mindful of engaging women in this effort, from victimization to empowerment. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to the number of international efforts to protect women and to support their participation in decision-making roles in the sphere of security. And these are at least 8 UN Security Council resolutions to address related concerns of women and protection and participation. More than 45 countries around the world now have adopted what are called national action plans on women, peace, and security as a way to address issues, everything from ending the scourge of sexual violence to ending violent extremism. I say this because the U.S. government in December 2011 developed their own U.S. National Action Plan, and it is now a U.S. policy that women must be considered in security processes of all sorts. It is a very detailed plan. The State Department, U.S. Aid, and DOD all have their own plans working with the NSC. Last week, Secretary of State Kerry's talk at the World Economic Forum in Davos emphasized the need to address the lethal messages that have attracted thousands of fighters from around the world. I would say that we must expand our aperture for understanding victimization and also the empowerment of women by making sure we understand the social processes that tie masculinity, hypermasculinity, to concepts of what it means to be a man using violence, and in this case, violent extremism. So I'm going to end there. Thank you for your time. And I do want to say on March 6th, we will be having a public forum in which we have invited 12 of these women from around the world to talk about their lessons learned in an effort we call Charting a New Course, Women Preventing Violent Extremism. I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
thank you very kindly for providing a context, a broader context, and some of the concerns and the role of women and the role of the international community. Now we're going to move on to specific case studies, and I would like to invite Professor Patricia Malden. She is a professor of conflict resolution, as I mentioned before, and you have her detailed bio, except to say that she worked on the whole area of child soldiers, the combatants, and so forth, and a great deal of experience throughout the world in Africa and Latin America. So we would like to invite you to speak on some of these issues, and then we'll develop a discussion.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased to hear the panelists' discussions and to have questions and engage with you about these issues. Kathleen did a marvelous job of setting it up. That was great. Thank you so much. The title of my I have to have a frame for what I do or I'll be all over the place. The Utility of the Vulnerable. Women, children, and politically motivated violence. In terms of defining terrorism, I base my thinking on the State Department ways that they break that out, just so you'll know where I'm coming from on that. And I call it politically motivated violence versus terrorism, and I'll talk about that, why that might be. Women and children have been victims of war throughout history, as we heard earlier. And historically, the end of the Cold War and the end of the proxy wars, post-Cold War, have caused a great deal of upheaval I particularly look at Africa. I've spent a good deal of time there. In West Africa, Sierra Leone and Liberia in particular. And if you remember any of those wars, you'll know they were pretty brutal. It wasn't necessarily called terrorism, but that's exactly what it was, if we use the State Department definition of what terrorism was. There were amputations, there were mass rapes, kids were involved in militia groups, women and girls were involved in militia groups, and so on and so forth. And a lot of people died. And the wars were fought in communities, villages, and rural areas primarily. And there were not the standard battle lines drawn. That is almost a thing of the past in some of these countries. So I'm looking at a very disordered set of war-fighting practices in West Africa. And in Colombia, there was a similar disorder, a purposeful disorder in the role of the FARC and the ELN. ELN mostly were in town, but the FARC was in the rural areas. And they meant to work through the rural areas and fight the war using the bodies of the rural residents. And by that, they gained territory, certainly, and in West Africa the same. They gained status, certainly, in West Africa the same. And they gained power over access to resources, land where they could, in Colombia's case, grow coca mass over huge hectares of land and make it very profitable. In West Africa, the profitability came from diamonds, bauxite, iron ore, selling people, slavery, things that we find appalling in a modern age. To think of women and the things that they've had to go through and live through and then return to their communities is almost beyond comprehension on an individual level. So I just want to put that right out there. And it's really difficult to talk to women about that. They don't want to talk about the more you talk about it, the more people remember. And the more people remember, the more the victimization starts all over again, and the more you're shunned. So it's not only that these things happen, it's that the effects of their happening bounce back on the victims again. And they're unwelcome, they're considered dangerous. If they happen to have children by any of their captors or rapists or whatever you want to call them, it's even harder because those children are neither part of the community, well, they are because their mother is. The father could be anybody and an enemy, and so the child naturally becomes a potential enemy and a danger to the group. So communities in this process of using women and children in ways that most sociocultural patterns do not include. Having, I mean, in the olden days, really olden days, Middle Ages, young boys came up through apprenticeships to become fighters, apprenticeships to knights, and that was part of the regular pattern. In the in the Revolutionary War here, there was a certain way that young folks participated. In the Civil War, young folks participated in various ways, not generally on the front line with a gun or with a weapon. When you give an AK to a young girl or a young boy, that is a terrorizing thing in and of itself. And we could say, well, why is it more terrorizing than to have an adult with an AK? For one thing, it goes against all the bounds of what we think is right. It turns society on its head. It turns power relations on its head. And it creates a huge feeling of uncertainty and fear, hence terrorism. And if society is shattered by this and more people become involved, and this is a pattern, although contextual differences will have it look slightly different in various places, it's a pattern with ripples across the world. It's very effective. It's not very effective in the sense of a standard government and having the kind of things we think of as important, but it does gain you territory and power and status. And for people who've been marginalized or who have not a set path put forward to adulthood, as Kathleen was discussing, there are violent transitions to adulthood that are an option. And that has happened through over the past 20, 30, 40, 50, perhaps longer years. And what I mean by the utility of the vulnerable is that the folks are vulnerable perhaps because of their gender and their age. But they're also vulnerable because of the contextual constraints with which they live. Their access to education is limited, if at all possible. Their access to, if they do get an education, jobs are almost non-existent. And in West Africa particularly, farming is manual. I mean, a hoe, and it's a hard ground, and it's a rough life, and young people don't want that. They want to have a job that reflects what they consider their capabilities, and that's a generational shift. So if we imagined ourselves as some of these commanders in these areas, if anywhere in the world, pick your place, if you have a large population of young people, say 50% of the population under the age of 18, and most of them don't have anything to do and are waiting to somehow have a path to adulthood, to build their house, to get married, to live a normal kind of life, and yet they're blocked from that. That's a problem. And I don't have a solution to that problem, but it reflects different processes internationally, globalizing economic things, transnational networks of industry and that sort of thing. And it trickles down. You throw a rock in a pond and there's going to be waves. And the waves are going to hit all on the other side, and you hadn't maybe thought about it that way, but that does happen. And it's not that I think it's intentional. I think it is just happens. So if you're going to use violence against women and children in an asymmetric strategy to win whatever power you can and territory you can, and attacking civilians rather than combatants, part of the reasons for doing that is your territory might be a direct or indirect goal on that. inflicting trauma and destroying families is very important to the upheaval of the society. If you're going to, thank you. To maintain power, you want disorder in this kind of a mindset. You want uncertainty and you want fear. And what better way than to destroy families? What better way than to destroy communities? To have women become damaged. And because of the sociocultural constructions, as Kathleen was talking about, if a woman is damaged, her value, which wasn't 100% equal with a man's usually anyway, has decreased substantially. And her children's value has decreased substantially. So it's hard to talk about the value of a human being, but some people are valued higher than others. And the people that are valued less are the ones at risk for being victimized and also for then victimizing others. In terms of the hypermasculinity in a lot of these military groups, the raping of women is a rite de passage. I mean, it's a rite of passage. You do it. And if you don't, oftentimes you will be killed. So it's a right, or you can do this or you can die. And then it becomes part of just the general thing. There's this brotherhood, some articles talk about the brotherhood of guilt. You'll notice it particularly with the some of the Boko Haram folks and some of the folks in the Middle East. The men cover their faces. Why do they cover their faces? So that when life goes back to whatever the new normal is, nobody's going to know it was them, although people will know that it was them. In West Africa, men changed their names. They had fighting names. And they retook their baptismal name or their given name when they got out of their military units. So what I'm saying here, basically, is that it's really complicated, or really, it's not complicated. The Hubble spacecraft is complicated. This is complex. This is extremely complex. Anything with human beings is very complex. And in terms of what to do about that, Kathleen had some wonderful ideas about programmatic things. But there are things on other levels of engagement, I think, that might need to be at least considered. The effects of some of the unintended consequences, perhaps, of land seizures, of plantation agriculture, of some of these things that are happening in post-war areas that are getting things back to what they were in a negative way. And one of the big things about this is when you humiliate someone's dignity, whether it's keeping them from achieving the status of an adult, a respectable adult, an adult who can support themselves, who has a job, who has their own dignity in that. Or if you are dehumanizing somebody through violating their person, those things will have negative effects one way or another for the life of those individuals. And I don't mean to be, and people are resilient and we can work through that as humans, but we need to take it into account. And if the future of a society is polluted through this violence and it fractures and weakens, it merely adds to the power, status, and motivation for folks that do this kind of thing. So it is in some ways a circle, cyclical, but in other ways, people can, as Kathleen has mentioned, there are ways to intervene in that process. And it will take some really brave people. And I mean brave people from the outside, but particularly from the inside, because the pressure inside is very, very tough. And sometimes it's life or death. So in terms of women have fought. They have condoned rape. They have actively and passively participated. And that's something we don't like to think about. I don't like to think about it. But it happens for the same kinds of reasons that I've been talking about. That in this context of violence, rules change, norms change, practices change, and they don't change for the better. And then those women, just as those men, will have to live with that. And the societies will have to live with that. So in terms of causal dynamics, there's the gendered norms, values, and practices, the difference in value of a man and a woman in society. And there's a difference. Corruption across sectors, the value of men and women individually and collectively, unequal access to resources, and then there's the non-elite and the elite valuation. The elite people are not the ones that are suffering this. They simply are not. Their kids are out of the country. Their kids are gone, or their kids are protected by armed guards, or whatever it takes. It is the non-elite who are the sufferers, and who are, in many cases, the foot soldiers. So I am merely pointing out the obvious, I suppose, but disorder is a political instrument, and it's very, very effective. And its effect on societies can be devastating to some and enriching to others. And I think that'll be something to talk about at some point, and just to think about, and to think of women women are victimized, children are victimized. But if we say only that they are victimized, their value is even less, because they have less agency in the world. So I just wanted to end with that, and I look forward to questions and everyone else's comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your remarks, and clearly triggered a lot of questions, but we'll wait until later on. But I would like to invite Nina Shia. As I mentioned before, she is the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and previously she was the director also of the Center for Religious Freedom at Freedom House. And I remember when you defended the Soviet dissident Andrei Sakharov before the UN and so on.
Thank you. Yeah.
International human rights lawyer.
Yeah, for a long time.
Right.
Yeah, Cold War. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to be on this panel. I deal with religious freedom, so I am going to be looking at these issues, our topic today, through sort of a religious lens. I'm a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, 30 years, and my expertise is in religious freedom around the world, particularly how U.S. policy can have an effect. So today, I'm going to be looking at just a piece of violent extremism. I'm looking at the rise of radicalism by a growing minority within the Muslim world. And this is happening despite the condemnation of important Muslim voices, such as Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad in Jordan, or Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq, Al-Azhar in Egypt, and so forth. Women and children are a distinct victim group within this phenomenon. And then those members of religious minorities who are women and children are then become doubly targeted or doubly victimized. Those who are embracing radicalism in the Muslim world have many grievances. There's economic, there's political, there's historical, governmental, and even psychological and personal. And they seem to conclude that their solution is violent, aggressive jihad and the formation of a utopic caliphate in a land that has then been purified for Islam. So we are seeing this played out, for example, over the past several months, past year in Iraq. Iraq had a large Christian population about 12 years ago, at over 1 million. Today, the remaining Christians, about 250,000, more or less, are not in Iraq proper. They've been driven out by the Islamic State or by ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them. They've been driven out to Kurdistan and neighboring countries. The Yazidis also, another non-Muslim population there. And like the Christians, were clustered in this Nineveh province in northern Iraq, have now been driven out. They've suffered just unfathomable hardship. The women, 5,000 Yazidi women have been, up to 5,000, we don't know the number for sure, have been enslaved by the Islamic State. They have been sold and resold. We know this because some have escaped and talked about it. Some have been given cell phones by their captors and were encouraged to call journalists that they knew to report their conditions. Children who have been, who are under the control of the Islamic State, whatever religion they are being, some of the boys now are being trained as militants. They're being desensitized to violence in particular programs. They are being taught to behead and kill, and there are videos of this. Women who have been left behind, now all in Mosul and Nineveh, are all Muslim now. They were probably always Muslim because the Christians and Yazidis have found it impossible to live there and have left or been killed. And those women are having a very difficult time. They are being forced into the most extreme vision of this group. They have to have male guardians. They are segregated. They have lost, many of them have lost their jobs. They're forced to wear a certain dress that is now posted on wall murals throughout Mosul about how to dress and behave as women now in this new regime. A woman recently, a professor from the University of Mosul who protested this, was recently executed. And the what we're seeing is that this has done basically irreversible harm, recapturing Mosul, which controls Nineveh, which is the most important city of Nineveh. That's where the water plants are. That's where the biggest universities and hospitals are. The biggest markets and trading centers are in Mosul. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be like capturing the Mosul Dam where you can just go back in and everything's the same once you're in control. It is changed probably forever, these people who have been driven out. And I should add, 500,000 Muslims left as well. So they also fled ISIS. The people who are left are either sympathetic to the ISIS program, are Salafis like them, extreme Salafis, or they're the officers of Saddam Hussein, or they have adapted. It's going to be very difficult to recapture it. It's not like Kobani, which we learned has been recaptured this past week after 4 months of constant bombing by the U.S. and the Peshmerga and the Kurds going in to fight it. That was an unoccupied city. The Kurds wanted to, were going to die fighting for it. And this is a completely different situation, much larger people filled with people who are probably have now, some of them made a common pact with ISIS. Some of them have married, been married forcibly or otherwise with ISIS. They will be having children starting in March. It's not going to be easy. So it could be quite, I believe what has happened is irreversible. Plus, these traces of this civilization, these Christian civilization, the Jewish civilization that used to be there, have been destroyed or are being in the process of being destroyed. Even the ancient walls around Nineveh, around Mosul now, are being blown up this week in the pre-Christian civilization, from the pre-Christian civilization there, so that it is being cleansed. This has inspired other groups. And in turn, ISIS is inspired by other radical groups like Al-Qaeda and grew out of Al-Qaeda. We're seeing either other groups pledge their fealty to like in Libya recently, or some of the Taliban, or there's one-upsmanship being practiced by other radical groups. Boko Haram in Nigeria is now declaring that it also has established a caliphate, and it is capturing territory. It is carrying out massive religious cleansing and driving out anybody who resists their commands. Their commands include banning all Western schools. That's what their name means. Western education and Western books is a sin. We saw the just horrifying spectacle of a 10-year-old girl in Nigeria being strapped with a suicide vest and being sent into a market and killing over a dozen people in this month. Last April, 300 girls were captured. Schoolgirls were captured in Chibok as they were taking their exams because they were determined to continue their education. I've interviewed some of those girls who've managed to escape within the first 48 hours. We learned from the head of Boko Haram that he made a statement on YouTube that these girls, the 300 who didn't escape, 275 who didn't escape, are now married to Muslim men, and they have converted to Islam, and they've already, according to him, memorized the first chapter of the Quran. So this, again, it follows this pattern that we saw with the Yazidis, this enslavement, this forcible marriage. And this 10-year-old girl raises the specter or the possibility that some of them are being sent out as suicide bombers. Others in Nigeria, children and girls are deeply, deeply traumatized, even if they're not enslaved, even if they're not killed. I interviewed a girl named Deborah Peters, who's 16 years old, and she was a Christian girl, and her father was a pastor, and the Boko Haram came into her home one night and demanded at gunpoint that her father and brother, who was 16 at that time, convert to Islam or die. And her father's response was, right before his head was blown off, was in front of her, was Jesus, Jesus. So, this girl is amazing that she is able to pick up something after several years of rehabilitation and psychological counseling, and is now also continuing on with her studies, which means so much to her. We've seen similar patterns. I'm not going to go into it for time. In Somalia with Shabab, and we're seeing it in Sinai and in Libya and various other places. In Pakistan, of course, Malala's name has already been raised. She's a young Muslim gal who also was shot in the head and managed to survive because of her desire for schooling. These are radical groups that are doing this. Sometimes their own governments, though, are either failing to protect them, and elections are coming up on February 14th in Nigeria, and it'll be interesting to see how that turns out, because there has been probably no one more remiss than the president of Nigeria in protecting its people in the north from the rampages of Boko Haram. I think, we have a military program, we have a counterterrorism program, but what we really have not taken up as a country in terms of policy is a contest of ideas. And this is extremely important to discredit what these groups are doing, to acknowledge that there is an ideology. This isn't just a tactic of violent extremism. Violent extremism in this case is both the ends and the means, because the jihad is considered, an aggressive jihad is considered a holy war here. It's considered they consider it their obligation. It's attractive to many people from around the world. Again, it's a tiny minority, but still, it's a big problem for the world. It is, as Secretary Kerry said at Davos, Switzerland forum, recently that it's really endangering both the jihad and the caliphate notion is endangering not only world peace but also world order, the nation state. And this February 18th White House summit that President Obama has called is going to engage a wide array of people from society to discuss a strategy, a unified world strategy on how to deal with this rise of violent extremism within the Muslim world. All the examples that Secretary Kerry gave at Davos to describe this summit are taken from from the examples I gave today. They're all the problems of extremism and radicalization within the Muslim world. The war of ideas, as Secretary Kerry said, has to be waged by is important, and we really look to the imams of the world to wage it. But I believe that we have a role who are not imams, both Muslim and non-Muslim have a role in putting pressure on governments, particularly foreign governments, who control their religious establishment, to address and discredit these issues of aggressive jihad or the caliphate or the bigotry, the violent bigotry against the religious other. And for example, so I'll just throw out one example. The government of Saudi Arabia, I have examined their textbooks over 4 different years since 9/11. And these are government Ministry of Education textbooks that direct the student to wage violent jihad to spread the faith. They include in their, and they still do, in the 12th grade. I met with they have in their Hadith book the protocols of the Elders of Zion taught as historical fact. I went to Saudi Arabia. I met with the Justice Minister, the Minister of Education. We discussed this. They talked about the need for reform. They don't defend it. I did talk to the Minister of Education, but the reform never gets done. The Minister of Justice, I challenged him on why the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a 19th century fraudulent text, was in their Hadith book about the stories of Muhammad's life. And he answered, well, it's a very old book. It was in my father's house. That was his answer. So we need to start pressing these foreign allies on these points. And again, their religious establishment are basically cabinet members in their governments. They're paid for and appointed by them, and they should be held responsible. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Obviously, you raised so many relevant questions to policy making and the role of religion. How can religion advance the cause of peace around the world? We'll come back to it. It's so critical. Now we're going to call on Professor Mike Noon, who is a professor at the Columbus School of Law. And prior to that, for many years, he served the U.S. Air Force as a judge advocate, and is involved in many of the activities dealing with military law and the laws of war and so forth, and is a close friend.
Thank you.
Mike? You have also some slides, I thought,
I
right?
have a highly qualified audiovisual person
Right.
who tells me that
Right.
she's highly qualified.
We have only experts here.
There are only 2, and why don't we toss up the first one right now? Our focus is supposed to be on women and children, and my presentation, brief presentation, is going to be about children only. That really doesn't need much explanation. Shall we try the other one? There's a little girl in there as well. So I thought, although the conference focuses on women and children as victims, I want to talk today about children as actors. Because as you know, this is illustrative, is a kind of a problem. The Oxford Dictionary defines a victim as the unwilling recipient of cruel or oppressive.
May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? We have concluded the testing of the fire alarm system. Please consider all future alarms as valid. May I have your attention, please? May I have your attention, please? We have concluded the testing of the fire alarm system. Please consider all future alarms as valid. Thank you.
Well, I'm the object of your sympathy, and I was just thinking there, but by the grace of God goes whoever the other speaker was. So I started to say the Oxford Dictionary defines a victim as the unwilling recipient of cruel or oppressive treatment. The Monday, January 12th issue of The Guardian newspaper reported from Lagos, Nigeria, a bomb attack in Potsdam, Yobe State, which killed 3 people and wounded 26, and an attack a day earlier in Borno State, which killed at least 16 people. The Potsdam bombing was attributed to suicide bombers described as, quote, little girls. Ms. Shea also previously referred to the Borno suicide bomber, who was a 10-year-old, stopped in the main market for a security check. Would you agree with me that the bombers were as much victims as the people they killed? And my thesis is that child bombers pose a particularly challenging threat for security forces because they're too young to be in security records, assuming that the state maintains security records, and if somehow a child were identified as a potential threat, there are many legal and cultural barriers to rehabilitation. How can a government legally protect its citizens from child suicide bombers? We in the U.S. can't look to our own experience, nor that of our fellow democracies, which share our legal traditions. Those traditions emphasize ex post facto punishment for criminal acts, well, none available if the child's a suicide. And in rare cases, legally mandated special treatment, counseling, possibly institutionalization, if the child is considered to be a prospective physical threat to the community. Our legal and medical institutions are sufficiently robust to cope with a prospective 10-year-old terrorist, but we've never had one. What of the children in, for example, Nigeria? Nigeria is the richest country in Africa. If it were to divert some of its oil revenues to its juvenile justice system, hoping that the threat of child bombers could be diminished, what obstacles would it meet? First, religion. These child bombers are apparently motivated by their Muslim religious beliefs. Well, I know that Christian religious beliefs have motivated killers, as has Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and I suspect Zoroastrianism. But the Judeo-Christian faiths do not sanction suicide. Their approval of martyrdom is derived from the concept of witness. The young child or adult permits herself to be killed rather than deny their faith. Religiously motivated behavior may challenge government institutions who seek to regulate it. When the U.S. was established, suicide was a crime, and I believe it still is. But unsuccessful suicides aren't prosecuted for 2 reasons. Either the authorities conclude that the perpetrator was mentally unstable, or if they conclude that he was rational, none of the punishments in their civic repertoire are particularly intended to discourage suicide. I submit that our legal system, legislative, executive, judicial, cannot protect us or the bombers from suicidal attacks. Community attitudes can encourage or discourage juvenile suicide bombing. In the U.S., we can sympathize with some rational suicides, those suffering from a terminal, perhaps painful disease. But suicide is not a culturally acceptable solution in the U.S. Other cultures may accept of it. Some of you will recall the Hindu self-immolations during the Vietnam War. But none of the suicide-accepting cultures would, I think, approve of a 10-year-old suicide, as do apparently some segments of Muslim society. So in response to Dr. Alexander's implicit question, what can be done about the victimization by encouraging politically motivated suicide of children, I can't offer any law-based solutions. Political authorities can attempt to regulate words and behavior intended to encourage child martyrdom. Religious authorities can challenge those who claim that the deity approves of child bombers. That's as far as I can go. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments. Yours, I guess. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mike. We are not going to let you go free here because, after all, I think security through law is so critical. And anyway, we'll come back to it. I would like to invite Dr. Mir Sadat to make some remarks, which I'm sure based on both the academic background, very rich background that he has, and government work. And it is interesting that he also had the opportunity to serve as a consultant for several film productions. And I'm going to mention it because it's relevant to our discussion of Charlie Wilson War and the Kite Runner, Afghanistan, and so on. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I think the most amazing experience I had, but more importantly my wife had, was meeting Tom Hanks. And then I was surprised, but also meeting Charlie Wilson. And God bless him, but he was very delighted to meet my wife too, and I had to I had to step inside that comfort zone very quickly. Thank you for the invitation, General Dr. Alexander. I'm very honored to be along such a great panel of practitioners and scholars. Today's my birthday. It's a milestone. So the dates you mentioned, Dr. Alexander, I'm going to go with the freeing of Auschwitz. I grew up in Germany, so actually we had a school trip to there, so that brings good memories of to my birthday probably, more candles to light. I'm also, I would not say a survivor, but someone that has survived a conflicted society. My parents originally were from Afghanistan, so there's some baggage and history and some interest that I have in this field. When I'm going to discuss, and luckily what happens when you're the last person, everything has been said, so you kind of maybe sum up a little bit. I'm going to look at this discussion from a political and from a national security perspective. And having said that, I have to disclaim, like every other government employee, that this is my voice, my narrative. I do not represent the United States government, DOD, the intelligence community, or any other entity within the U.S. government. One thing that one of my mentors mentioned, retired now General Flynn, Michael Flynn, he reminded us in his retirement ceremony that we're going to be in this state of perpetual struggle against terrorism. No matter how quickly, how smart we react, others, like was said in this asymmetric struggle, will be smarter. And so we constantly need to innovate, and we need to get outside of our comfort zone. And DoD has been trying to do that, and it's been a big struggle with alliances with USAID and other types of NGOs. The other piece that's important too that was mentioned here, the government uses this generic term violent extremism or extremists. We need to define who we are countering against. Otherwise, we will have a generic solution that does not fit the particular problem. Before the government, I was very intimately involved with Amnesty International and having dealt with some of these aspects, whether it's women empowerment, education reform, literacy, and there are many elements that complement that. From the general perspective, though, we need to take a step back and look at the changing nature of terrorism. Terrorist groups today and ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever flavor we want to call it, thinks of itself as a state. They're no longer contained with the title of terrorist group. They want to be perhaps called a terrorist state. Before, terrorist groups had political ambitions. Today, it is, and it was considered that when people engaged in terrorism, it was to avenge some kind of a political grievance. Now, we have to expand that thinking. They are fighting for scarce resources, whether it's in Africa, the Middle East, or South Asia, and they're fighting for the distribution of those resources, the right to distribute those resources, right? ISIL sits on a gigantic revenue right now, which we can't stop. We have to take a long lens back and look at the 1980s, and Charlie Wilson was definitely someone who was a participant in this, but the jihad, the holy struggle against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, and what that came to bear. The jihad then did not include suicide bombers. The jihad then respected non-combatants on the battlefield, and it was largely, if there was some kind of casualties, it was a collateral damage that we would define in DoD. So it was not deliberate. The evolution of this idea of the suicide warrior or bomber is interesting, right? Because it goes back to a early Islam interpretation of how did the Prophet ascend to the heavens from Jerusalem? And did the Prophet ascend in body or did the Prophet ascend in spirit? That now has been defined by the terrorist groups. He ascended in spirit, not in body. The body is just a vessel. So therefore, although the Quran says if you kill one person, it's as if you killed all of humanity, today you can kill that body of yours because your spirit will go to heaven. And the interpretation of this is only depressed people commit suicide. When it's acts of heroism and valor, that's not suicide. So this is another wrinkle into this adversary's toolkit that we have to recognize. On top of this, as we are looking at how jihad was fought in the 1980s, it is now very acceptable to maim, kill, mutilate, rape, put on public display, whether it was the Taliban in the early days of chopping off little boys' arms who were just accused. They didn't have that Sharia judge, witnesses were not present, to now, hangings, different types of mutilations in the case of even Gaddafi's bodyguards, right? Sexual organs mutilated and on display. So these are things that now we have to deal with, and the clock cannot be turned back. So how do we confront this? Into the mix now, the jihadis currently right now, they make up most of the Afghan cabinet. They make up large portions of the Pakistani military. They make up the successor to the Saudi king. The new form of jihadis possess anti-Westernism, modernism, education. So they are no longer friends of ours. And they are now localizing this ideology with tribalism and patriarchal order in their societies. So, for example, ISIL is not just a duck, it is now firmly planted like an elephant's foot or hoof. It's not going to go anywhere because it is tied to the local culture. A lot of scholars, sociologists call them cosmic warriors. We are now facing cosmic warriors. Are we equipped, whether it's the Department of Defense, Department of State, civilians, diplomats, humanitarians, to deal with the narrative of cosmic warriors, to deal with the actions of cosmic warriors? And these cosmic warriors, because it's cosmic, they don't have finite aspirations. They don't want to just take over Baghdad. They don't want to just take over Damascus. They want the whole globe. They don't want to just convert the Christians in their country, in Iraq. They want to convert all of Christianity. Why not? Why stop? They want to reconvert the Shia back to becoming Sunnis. So this is something that is a major threat. It is also a great opportunity for alliances that could have never existed before, right? The second point of non-combatants on the battlefield. You know, the DoD interpretation was we don't harm them. The early guidance that Muhammad gave to his forces that took over Mecca, don't go into anybody's compounds or doors, leave their women and children. Jihadis today are not following that prescription by Muhammad. And I think the history that these jihadis are following is the one that happened in Munich with the Olympics. That event then set the events in motion that we see today. The non-combatants on the battlefield serve as a bargaining tool. If I can have you be fearful that if you take a certain action and I will come in and I will slaughter your Christians, your minorities, your women, your children, whatever it is, I have a bargaining tool. The threat of that is a bargaining tool. That's an important aspect to recognize. The other is, it is an explicit conveyance of this is my area of operation. I can do whatever I want to this. I have just delegitimized the state that claims to be running this nation. And where is the United Nations? Where is NATO? Where are all these other regional organizations? And the ability that unfortunately the United States of America, nor do any of these NATO alliances that we have at their possession. Religious edicts, a fatwa. I am a Sadat. Sadat is a definition, by definition, is a plural of Sayyid. My heritage goes back to Mecca. If I wanted to, I could give an edict. And if my clansmen and my countrymen accept it, it will be followed. It is general, without offending anything, it is stronger than a general order. It is international. And the most important piece of this disparaging and dehumanization of the non-combatants on the battlefield is to recruit more. The ability to show and say, this is what we are capable of, and nobody says anything to us. Very similar to criminals and gangs in major urban cities that we see across the world. And it's a retention tool. If you stop, because there's no retirement in ISIL, you are in forever. And they've executed hundreds of deserters because they've realized this is not for them, or they don't want it. They're not like the Taliban. Remember the 5 DC volunteers that they sent back saying you are not competent enough? They will take the most incompetent people and they will give them tasks where they are good at. So they also threaten their own internal community as well, which is an important tool. So women, children, minorities, dissenters, and the public display of brutality is something that interrelates to one of these categories. And the idea of these cosmic warriors is jihad al-daf, right? A defensive jihad. We are fighting a defensive jihad because our community as a whole is under attack. The few trends that I see from my vantage point, and I mean, if I wish I could show you the things that we have in the government to show you the gaps we have, and also some of the great analysis we have. Unfortunately, we can't do that. There are going to be higher numbers of victims per event. Expect that as a trend. It's not going to be onesies and twosies, and the events in Egypt are an indicator of that. It'll be highlighted with symbolic victims, these beheadings. These are fantastic I.O. campaigns, information operations campaigns, and public display of brutality on the streets. You can't walk around various ISIS territories without seeing mutilated bodies, without seeing people lashed. So that's a constant reminder. And higher numbers of indirect victims. You know, I'm a naval reservist officer. I've been trained on a lot of things that the DoD does for their military, and I'm a DoD civilian. And I've seen little girls blown up by suicide bombers in Afghanistan right outside of our compound. And I got to tell you, it is not a good sight. And it's a sight that even though I was not a participant in the event, I was just a bystander and I walked by, it is something that constantly is in the back of my mind. Right? I'm a father of a 5.5-year-old daughter, and I would hate to see that, especially when you know the story about it. 7 girls or 8 girls joining an NGO called Skatistan, trying to become skaters. And the suicide bomber, a 15-year-old kid, not knowing what he's doing. So how do you deal with this? And I would like to shift to, I think, an important topic that was discussed too is the role of women. ISIS has an entire unit of women officers who go around making sure women are covered properly, women obey the decrees, that women teach the right things to their children. They have turncoats in families. This is not unlike, I don't want to compare it to World War II, but they are using tactics out of the Nazi handbook, telling kids, turn your parents in if they're doing the wrong things. Right? So this is an important thing, that this is an organization that's very organic and it's learning. So what do we know? What are our priorities? When you look at the Department of Defense, our main concern is force protection. Force protection of our bases, of our civilians, of our military, of our diplomats, and that's what we're concerned about. The Department of Defense does not have a metric to see how much violence is being committed against children, women, what type of corporal punishments are taking place on a daily basis. So we don't have that piece because we consider it in the Department of Defense a law and order issue. Law enforcement should be taking care of that, perhaps. The intelligence community is made up of bright analysts, but very few of them are gender, women's studies, cultural studies majors. So when they are writing reports, when they are writing analysis, when they are responding to taskers, to the military decision makers or the policy makers, that is not included in their analysis. And also the intelligence community is not being tasked to look for that. So where do you spend your finite resources? And I think the one thing that if we could change the definition of sexual violence or violence against children and make that equal to a terrorist attack against a building or against killing individuals, then that way this would become a priority. And that would be my suggestion to my government. And I agree with Nina Shea. Fighting this new terrorism requires more than just kinetic, right? Whether it's conventional or special forces engagements, this requires something more complicated. It's definitely ideological, and it's information. And while I respect the President of the United States explaining Islam to Muslims, or the Secretary of State explaining Islam to Muslims, they are not in a position of authority in the Muslim world, right? Because who are you trying to convince? If you're trying to convince my family, who are moderate Muslims, that's fine. But my family's not the one blowing up the place, right? Who are you trying to convince? You need to go to those centers of gravity, the centers of influence, those countries that have bankrolled these groups, the countries that are allowing them to have money going through different banks to other countries. Saudi Arabia. President Karzai, President Ashraf Ghani, whether it's President Musharraf, they have no influence over this. You need to go to those specific centers and ask them and say, we would like your help on this, because this is a problem for the region, for the world. And I think I've heard thousands of scholars, Islamic scholars, denounce violence. Until we get to that point where some of these leaders and countries, the new king of Saudi Arabia comes out and denounces this, we will not be at that place where we want to be in dealing with religious violence committed by Muslims. With that, I want to finish, and I want to thank you for the opportunity, and also just remind you that these are my expressions and views and not the United States government's. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadat, for your remarks and your analysis of the nature of the threat, the outlook, and some of the responses. Before we turn the discussion to the audience, I would like to invite members of the panel perhaps to make some comments or raise some questions. Anyone? I do have obviously a laundry list of questions, but let me ask one related to the threats. I think, Patricia, you spoke on the case study of Colombia. And my question is that when we talk about terrorists or insurgents and all that, how about the role of gangs and organized crime in terms of, let's say, human trafficking and narco trafficking and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and within the country and outside the country, and the interregional nexus and so forth. How do you deal with that challenge? You can sit there or you can come up here and anybody else, right?
Can you hear? Yeah, I'll just sit here. Well, that's a big question. Often, or occasionally, or sometimes, or frequently, depending, the insurgent groups connect with other criminal organizations and increase their portfolio of resource-generating opportunities. FARC has done some of this. I can't speak to their alliances with human trafficking, although there's been hints in the things I've read in the past about it. Human trafficking is a business, and it, think of some of the folks that have been kidnapped in the Middle East and in Africa, that the monies that those people who were sold, usually women but not always, the monies generated went into continuing the conflict, or continuing the fight, or continuing the battle, or whatever we want to call it. And it is, in some cases, separate from, but in some cases, part of ways to create disorder, ways to finance that disorder, and ways to up the status of your organization. There were the 275 young women in Nigeria that were kidnapped, and the others that have been kidnapped since, men and girls and boys. What Boko Haram says is that they're all married, and that may be true, but even if they are, they can still be sold. And even if they are, they can still be moved from place to place. And that speaks back to the value of a woman or a girl in the marketplace. What is that value, and who makes the decision whether or not to put them on the auction block, so to speak? And slavery is a huge problem in the world, and so I think it just is. I can't speak to exactly, and those things would be really hard for me to track. I don't have access to that information, but I think it's another form, certainly, if you're at risk in an area that is being swept over by an insurgent group, a terrorist group, or what have you, you are certainly at risk for being captured and sold. And if that's not terror to the family, to the community, and to the individual, then I think it is. I don't know if that answers it, but.
Yes, please.
Well, I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I'm really interested in this nexus of children, peace, and security. And so, Professor Noon, I appreciate your problematizing this problem of how can a government protect its citizens from a child suicide bomber, and that children, in fact, are now agents in the security sphere. So using your premise, I'd like to ask Dr. Sadat, how much is our intelligence community, DoD, factoring in children are now agents of this process, and your trends are pretty pessimistic, and I'm wondering how you would factor in Professor Noon's comment about this dilemma of children now being inculcated from very young ages.
Sorry.
So if I'm looking at it strictly from a unclassified perspective, the way we looked at, for example, right after 9/11, we looked at Pakistan and Afghanistan. We saw close to 5,000 madrasa schools along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and we assumed that they would be spreading the Deobandi Deobandi/Wahhabi doctrine, which is a type that ISIL is very much affiliated with, and encourages violence and memorization of the Quran and someone else explaining to you what the Quran is. We don't have, I don't think, we don't have that capability anywhere else in the Middle East, because the entire interagency came to bear on that border. We had that. Right now, with all these flare-ups all over, with the Sahel, North Africa, Egypt, Middle East, still Afghanistan, Pakistan hasn't gone away. We have no capability for that. With the in addition, the damages that have been done with various leaks and case officers' identity being compromised and so forth, the intelligence community has become very risk averse. So they won't send someone somewhere to go find things. You'll probably, this is my prediction, you'll probably see the intelligence community even outsource human intelligence, where companies, you and I can probably start up a company and we would get that information for them. And as a result, there are these various types of partnerships and reach out and forums that we're going out and dealing with think tanks and
How about
other
drones?
types.
Drones as a
Drones is another aspect, but it gives you a very descriptive structural aspect. If they are exercising outside, you'll get that piece, but you won't get what they're learning in the classroom. So there's a lot of, in general, the intelligence community is inundated with information that it cannot sift through. It's basically go on a vacation and then come back and check your mailbox, and you have 3 seconds to make all the decisions you want to make. Very, very tight schedule.
So, in other words, if you added children to your list of trends, where would you put that in your storybook?
I would put it very high up. For example, just looking at ISIL and Professor Alexander, and Dean Alexander wrote this great book that's coming out, and I did some outside research on it. For example, if you're looking at all the people that are going into Syria right now, you know they're going in from Turkey. You don't know where they're going from. And I would pose that question to the intelligence community to tell me where they're going to. and I would tell you they probably would have a very tough time as well.
Okay, anyone else on the panel?
I just
Okay,
want to.
Let me ask, yes,
I just want to make a note of with what Nina was talking about in terms of the disorder of the global. That was my phrase, but just the idea that we're gonna shake the whole global order out, and that seems to be, I've heard that certainly from Dr. Sadat and from others. So, how do we think about that in terms of, I mean, from academic point of view and from different agency points of view? I think that's something to be explored, certainly in more detail in future.
okay. I have one more question, one to Nino and then one to Mike. Nino, you worked for many years trying to advance the the role of religious freedom and the protection of individual and collective human rights. And you had the opportunity to meet with the Pope, for example. Now, do you think that the role of religion is so critical in order to diffuse some of the negative concepts, ideas, terms, and so on from political conflict? And what specifically can we do? Of course, the Pope does not represent the Muslim world, but at any rate, the way he's trying to lead the world to not only condemn, but also to ban the use of violence, specifically mentioned also women and children. So can you talk a little bit about that particular aspect?
Yeah, I did meet with Pope Francis. I met with him about 2 days or 3 days before ISIS rolled into Mosul, which was the ancient Christian center and where a lot of the Christians were clustered, and in the capital of this Nineveh state, which is where the rest of the Christian population of Iraq is now, or was. My message to him was to elevate your voice, to keep, he has talked about this as the worst age of persecution for Christians since the first century of Christianity in the Roman Empire, and that there are more, what he said is that there are more martyrs today than there were then. But I urged him to become more specific and to keep it up and do it more, because there really, this point about the high risk of these minorities from these radical groups, and in Nigeria and Pakistan and various other places, it was completely being missed, including in Iraq and in Syria, because at the same time that there was a war going on over the since 2003 in Pakistan, in Iraq, and in the last couple of years in Syria, there are many things going on, many moving pieces, many targets. Muslims are being targeted, and they're clashing, and there's some would say a Sunni Shiite contest going on. And what was happening to the minorities, the Mandeans, who have been completely eradicated now from Iraq, and the Yazidis and the Christians, was being missed. They were seen as collateral damage, or maybe caught in the middle, the crosshairs, caught in the middle. What was being missed was that there was a targeting of them underneath the bombs, as one patriarch put it, that underneath the bombs and the guns there was a religious cleansing going on. In fact, I've stopped using the term religious persecution in these places because it's so bad. It really is a religious cleansing. It's a crime against humanity. That phenomenon, which was a goal of ISIS, to religiously cleanse an area, to purify it for Islam, according to their vision, that goal has been achieved. They have won that goal, and the West seemed incapable of seeing it at that time. I think Now it's a little clearer to some, but I think the United States really has not, our policymakers have not really grasped it yet, that there is, that one of the ideological goals, not just the means or not just a collateral phenomenon or development, was the eradication of Christians, Yazidis, Mandaeans, the Shia from this area, and the Muslims who wouldn't go along with the program. And that has taken place in northern Iraq, in a swath of Iraq, I should say.
Okay, thank you very much. Very quickly, Mike, do you think that if the international community will try to draft an international convention banning radicalization and violence against women and children, is this a step that can have practical implications?
No. I'll explain. I'll explain what I mean. First of all, it would be very hard, I think you would agree, you're more experienced than I, to achieve a consensus on what those terms mean. And I think that's the whole problem from the very beginning. As we're part of the Western European liberal tradition, and those terms have special meaning for us that wouldn't apply to anybody who doesn't come from our tradition. So I think it'd be very hard, impossible to get a consensus. I think there is something, though, that we could do that we're not doing, which is shame the people who are doing these terrible things. Nina's examples. There's been very little talked about of this sort of conversion behavior. That you don't have to be a specialist. All you have to be able to do is to read in the Washington Post if the Washington Post would write about it, and they're not. And I think it's at that level, or perhaps I'm exaggerating, but I don't think I am. I think it's at that level consciousness could be raised enough so that at least the people who are defending that kind of behavior or accepting that kind of behavior would have to respond and explain why they think that's morally acceptable. That's not being done, and I think it could be done.
Could I add something?
Yes,
Yeah, I was intrigued that, there's a saying that there is that Sunni Islam is not capable of changing, that there's doors to Ijtihad or reasoning have shut many centuries ago. But at the same time, there's an acknowledgement by Al-Azhar in their statement repudiating what ISIS was doing, saying that ISIS was bad because it had violated the consensus of the Sunni Muslim world against slavery, that no Muslim government, Muslim majority government, government of Muslim majority country acknowledges that slavery is right or good or proper or that it's practiced in their borders. Now, there may be violations. I mean, there's sexual trafficking here. It's against the law here. It's against their law, too. And so that has evolved in modern contemporary times in the Muslim world, that slavery has been abolished. I also should say that I have seen in my own research that the execution of Christians for their Christian beliefs has the actual going through with that, not just the threat of that or sentencing to that, was eliminated. I mean, I don't see, there are radical governments like Iran and Sudan and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan that have maybe, and Afghanistan, that maybe sentenced Christians to death, mostly for converting or for evangelizing. They actually didn't go through with it. They found reasons or rationales for letting, Mariam Ibrahim leave Sudan last summer, for example. But this order is being overturned. I think those were interesting developments consistent with the sort of universal human rights perspective. There are many other human rights problems all over and in those countries as well. But I think that because of the world pressure, world consensus that slavery is bad, and the West came out of slavery, 150 years ago, and then the Muslim world also repudiated that. That gives me a little bit of hope that if we start a discussion about how this utopic vision of a caliphate is going to turn very quickly into a dystopia, because we've seen that in every experiment that's ever been tried in history of a utopia, or that violent jihad is just is an aggressive measure that violates the peace, that maybe there can be another consensus.
Anyone else from the panel? Okay, we have time for one or two quick questions. Okay, please, Pat.
This is for Dr. Sadat. It seems to me that in Muslim areas like Chechnya, to a degree possibly Palestine, Dagestan, what was nationalism and had a specific goal like independence for Chechnya is morphing into religious fanaticism, if you will, even if the same guys are doing it, but now they're getting more and more religious, which, as you yourself said, is cosmic and almost without any bounds to it except worldwide domination, if you want to put it that way. One of the things that struck me about these two guys, Dagestanis, in Boston, was that one of them was named after a patron saint of Muslim, fighting, namely Tamerlane. Nobody pointed it out. The only person I ever heard pointed out, except myself looking it up in the dictionary, was somebody who called in to Rush Limbaugh, not Limbaugh himself, but somebody who called in and pointed out that this guy was named after Tamerlane, who was a leading Muslim fighter of several centuries ago. And so I'm kind of interested in your comment on whether this is in fact happening, and if it is happening, more from political to religious, goals, perhaps you could say, it's going to be much harder to defeat, I think.
Definitely an important piece. If you look at the Middle East or South Asia, experiments with nationalism occurred, failed experiments with the left, communism, socialism, whatever you want to look at, Marxism occurred. It failed for whatever reasons, whether it was external influences and making sure those movements don't succeed or reactions to it. So Islam now, or religion, is the only other viable option of venting those frustrations out. The problem with now this new wave is, whereas the other movements, the nationalistic and the socialistic, communist, Marxist, whatever, might have been as evil or as violent, there was a standard of education and a level of logic. Now you have poverty, the lack of education, plus someone else telling you what to think and how to behave without you actually reading it and accepting it. So this is going to be a problem that we have to fight, what I would consider, in quotations, the long war. And the long war is not against necessarily the ideology, but actually eradicating poverty and fixing the educational system, which is going to be very costly and will never be achieved, perhaps.
Okay, I think the clock is ticking. General, you have another? Yeah.
Yes.
One more. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No speeches.
Yes, yes.
No speeches. I'm very delighted to be here. My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran, and I'm a Muslim. So the question is this: that every time these meetings or seminars are conducted, there's always point to that these people want to get the whole world to do what they want to do. And this is a very good question, and I just refer you to the last verses that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which in that verse it says that today we completed your religion, we have given you all the bounties, and in the vision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the religion is Islam. Now, nobody is going to try to, by force, to make everybody Muslim. No. But that is the vision. And some people say, well, if you don't come along peacefully, I'm going to kill you. No, that's not Islam, because there is no way to indoctrinate anybody to believe in the Creator unless that person is willing to go that way themselves. And also, one more comment about Arabia. The king of Arabia died a few days ago, and another person took the place of the king. 5 months ago, mysteriously, the oil prices started coming down. from $120 to $40. So they knew that when the king dies, the world is going to be really pushing hard for the Wahhabis to get out of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Chechnya, and all over the place, that they're indoctrinating people to do very, very wrong things that Islam has got nothing to do with it. So they paid me. So I have to be silent because I was paying $3.50 per gallon of gas. Now I pay only $1.99. So I'm quiet. So are you. So is everybody else. So nobody is saying anything. So after 6 months, after 7 months, it's the same old again. And the money comes, big money, not small money, comes from there to madrasa, as the brother over here mentioned, and everybody else knows. So root causes needs to be found what it is. Aspirin will not be a medicine to cure the ail that has been there for many, many years. So with my humble opinion, we need to look at the picture, total picture, not only one side of the coin, both sides of the coin. Thank you very much, Eunice.
Anybody want to answer that question? Yeah. Well, I want to, on behalf of Potomac Institute and certainly on behalf of myself as well, to thank the panel for what I think was a superb set of presentations on a very, very difficult matter, one that's I think of paramount importance for the free world as we know it today. And so, all of your comments I thought were well put together and certainly very meaningful. It's obvious, again, as I've said a number of times, we have a large challenge on our hands, not just the United States, but again, our allies, our friends, and as I say, the free world as we know it today. And it's not just a kinetic thing or a military matter. It's really a global matter, and it really needs the direct and constant attention of all of the elements of national power and influence and international influence as well. It's a societal problem. It's certainly a huge educational problem, and we have a tremendous educational challenge here in the United States as well as in the free world. It's an information operational challenge of immense proportions to include countering the evil propaganda that these people are using as a primary weapon. We must understand, too, that terrorism is a tactic. It is not anything else but a tactic. It's been used for years and years and years. You can find examples of terrorism and terrorism tactics, if you will, in all of the major religious documentation, regardless of the great religions of the world. It's there. It's used to scare people and scare groups and scare villages and all of that kind of thing so that they will do what they're supposed to do and not counter what's going on. It was used in China. It's part of Mao Zedong's phase of 4 phases of warfare. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were masters at it. You mentioned having us in Kabul. Doctor, you mentioned seeing the child with her arms blown off, and I have mentioned before in October of 1965 when I was south of Da Nang, and I saw a small Vietnamese girl run across a rice paddy crying and screaming. Her father had been a village chief. Her father had been pro-South Vietnamese. Her father had been killed the night before, and she had her arms cut off at her elbows by the Viet Cong, and she was coming to us for help. So this kind of thing has been around, and we need to understand this. And we understand that it's not just the Nazi way of warfare, and we all know about that. They had their techniques were barbaric. If you were caught in a village where the Germans were in World War II doing something against the German military, they simply lined up 200 or 300 civilians and killed them. So this kind of idea to scare people, to threaten people, to keep people quiet, et cetera, it's been around a long, long time, and the experts can probably trace this back to the human being and warfare and all that kind of thing, which I won't get into, and certainly I don't know a heck of a lot about. Somebody mentioned Tamerlane, I think, and all that. Actually, if you trace him back far enough, he goes to Genghis Khan. And yet Genghis Khan was a believer in religious freedom. And Genghis Khan permitted, in fact, insisted that the various religions coexist all through Central Asia back in his time. Or if you want to talk more about it, it was the Wahhabi tradition, the Wahhabi idea goes back to the 1200s, really, and it was put together by the Islamic crowd to counter Genghis Khan. So these kind of things have been around a long, long time. So why do I say that? It's of paramount importance we know our history. We need to know our global history. We need to know, as I've said, the educational process of this. We need to know the cultures, the mores, the languages, all of that. We keep looking at these countries and these people through our eyes instead of their eyes. And so we've got a massive challenge on our hands, but I'm the eternal optimist. We've had massive challenges before. We've come to grips with it. We've developed the kind of strategies and capabilities and so on that are needed. We learn over time to be good listeners instead of talkers, because you never learn anything while you're chatting and all that kind of thing. So I think we'll get our act together one of these days, and I hope the sooner the better, and I hope that all of you keep the faith. We can win this. It'll take a long time. As I've said in other seminars, we had a big problem in the 70s and 80s with Soviet submarines. That was one of our biggest technical challenges outside of the nuclear challenge. And yet, and it was a hard one to come up with, and yet we picked off a little bit of the apple at a time, and we did a little of this and a little of that, and here and there and everywhere. We got smarter, and we got smarter about material and all that kind of thing, and all of a sudden we had a very, very good capability after about a decade of study and thought and so on. And this is the kind of thing that I think ought to go on starting yesterday. With that, thank you all again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next seminar. Thank you, Yona.
Thank you very much again.